A thug taunted a royal guard, convinced the soldier wouldn't dare react. But the moment he lifted his fist toward an elderly veteran, the guard broke his silence and everything shifted. What happened next left the entire crowd in shock, and the thug publicly disgraced. Want to know how it all unfolded? Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into the story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, as hundreds of tourists gathered for the changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Danny the Brute Callahan, a mountain of muscle wrapped in cheap leather, and covered in prison tattoos that told stories of violence and bad decisions. At 6'4" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Danny had spent most of his 32 years intimidating anyone who dared look at him sideways. He cracked his knuckles as he surveyed the scene, his cold blue eyes settling on the motionless figure of Sergeant Thomas Whitmore of Her Majesty's Grenadier Guards. Whitmore stood at perfect attention, his red tunic pristine, his bearskin hat casting a shadow over eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The ceremonial rifle in his hands wasn't just for show, it was an extension of his very being, held with such precision that it seemed welded to his body. Danny had come here for one reason, to prove a point. In his twisted worldview, these guards were nothing more than tourist attractions, fancy dress-up soldiers playing pretend for the cameras. He'd made a bet with his crew back in East London that he could make one of these toy soldiers break character. The stakes were high, 500 pounds and his reputation on the line. "Look at this plastic soldier," Danny announced loudly, his Cockney accent cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Standing there like a bloody statue. Bet I can make you flinch, mate." He began his approach, each step deliberate and menacing. The tourists around him started to back away, sensing trouble brewing. Danny positioned himself inches from Whitmore's face, his breath reeking of cigarettes and cheap alcohol. He could see his own reflection in the guard's polished buttons, but Whitmore's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, unwavering. The discipline was absolute. Not even a twitch of an eyelid betrayed any emotion. The crowd had formed a loose circle now, phones coming out to record what was surely going to be either comedy gold or complete disaster. Children hid behind their parents' legs, while tour guides nervously tried to redirect their groups away from the brewing confrontation. But like witnesses to a car crash, most couldn't look away. Danny's smirk began to falter as minutes passed without so much as a blink from the guard. This wasn't going according to plan. In prison, in the pubs, on the streets, everyone eventually cracked under his intimidation. But this man, this soldier, seemed carved from stone itself. Frustration boiled over into rage. Danny had built his entire identity around being the toughest guy in the room, and this silent, motionless figure was making him look like a fool in front of hundreds of witnesses. His face flushed red as he began pacing back and forth in front of Whitmore, gesturing wildly. "What's wrong with you? You deaf? You blind? Or just too scared to move?" Danny's voice rose to a shout, spittle flying from his lips. Still, Whitmore remained statue-like, his breathing so controlled it was barely perceptible. The tension reached a breaking point when Danny, in a moment of pure malice, gathered saliva in his mouth and spat directly onto Whitmore's perfectly polished black boots. The crowd gasped collectively, a sound like air being sucked from the courtyard. This wasn't just disrespect, it was desecration of everything the uniform represented. For the briefest moment, Whitmore's eyes flicked downward to his boots, then back up to their fixed position. That tiny movement, lasting perhaps a fraction of a second, was the only acknowledgement he gave to Danny's vile act. But something had changed in the air. Even Danny, in his rage-addled state, could sense it. What Danny didn't know was that he was facing a man forged in the crucibles of Afghanistan and Iraq. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore had joined the army at 18, straight from a council estate in Manchester where his father had died in the Falklands, and his mother worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. The military had given him purpose, discipline, and a brotherhood that transcended blood. Whitmore had served for tours of duty in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. He'd carried wounded comrades through minefields, held dying soldiers in his arms, and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for entire units. The ceremonial posting at Buckingham Palace was supposed to be his reward, a chance to serve his queen and country in a peaceful setting after years of combat. But peace, Whitmore had learned, was relative. Standing guard required a different kind of courage, the courage to remain motionless in the face of provocation, to maintain dignity when others tried to strip it away, to be a living symbol of everything the crown represented. Danny, Meanwhile, turned to the crowd with his arms spread wide, flexing his considerable muscles for the cameras. See, useless, just a bloody toy for tourists. Can't even defend himself, his voice carried across the courtyard, and several tourists looked uncomfortable with the display. It was then that an elderly gentleman stepped forward from the crowd. Norman Briggs was 82 years old. His frame stooped with age, but his eyes still sharp and clear. The Royal British Legion cap on his head marked him as a veteran, though few could guess the depth of his service. The medals on his chest told a story of D-Day, the liberation of Europe, and battles that had shaped the modern world. "Son," Briggs said in a voice that carried the weight of authority despite its gentle tone, "you're making a fool of yourself. These men deserve your respect, not your contempt." Danny whirled around, his face twisting into a mask of rage. Here was this frail old man, probably weighing less than half what Danny did, daring to challenge him. In Danny's world, age meant weakness, and weakness was something to be exploited. "Shut it, old man," Danny snarled, raising his massive fist. "Before I put you in the ground where you belong." The threat hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several people in the crowd screamed, and mothers pulled their children closer. Norman Briggs, for his part, didn't flinch. He'd faced down Nazi machine gun nests and SS officers. One London thug wasn't about to intimidate him now. But before Danny's fist could complete its arc toward the elderly veteran, something extraordinary happened. The motionless guard moved with lightning speed that defied belief. Whitmore's ceremonial rifle, that symbol of pageantry and tradition, became a weapon of precise defense. The wooden stock intercepted Danny's punch with such force that the crack of impact echoed across the courtyard like a gunshot. The crowd froze in stunned silence. Danny staggered backward, his hand already swelling from the impact with what felt like a steel bar wrapped in wood. But Whitmore was already back in position, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his expression unchanged. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like nothing had happened at all. "What the hell?" Danny began, but the words died in his throat as he looked into Whitmore's eyes for the first time. What he saw there wasn't the blank stare of a ceremonial guard, but the cold calculation of a professional soldier. This man had killed before, and he could kill again if necessary. For the first time in his adult life, Danny Callahan felt genuine fear. The moment stretched like a taut wire. Danny flexed his injured hand, his pride warring with the growing realization that he'd bitten off more than he could chew. The crowd waited in breathless anticipation, phones still recording, history being made in real time. Whitmore moved again, this time stepping smoothly between Danny and Norman Briggs. The movement was fluid, economical, and utterly professional. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly across the silent courtyard. "That old man stormed the beaches of Normandy while you were still a gleam in your father's eye," Whitmore said, his words measured and precise. "He fought to keep this country free while you've spent your life trying to tear it down. What have you done besides embarrass yourself and dishonor the memory of better men?" The words hit Danny like physical blows. Around him, the crowd began to murmur their agreement. These weren't just tourists anymore. They were witnesses to something larger than themselves, something that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to serve others rather than oneself. Danny's response was predictable and tragic. Faced with truth he couldn't accept and shame he couldn't process, he did what bullies always do when cornered. He lashed out with violence. His right hand shot forward in a haymaker that would have felled most men. But Sergeant Thomas Whitmore wasn't most men. The guard's reaction was poetry in motion. He sidestepped Danny's wild swing with minimal effort, grabbed the extended arm, and used Danny's own momentum against him. In one fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of training and real-world application, Whitmore twisted Danny's arm behind his back and drove him face-first into the cobblestones. The impact was decisive and final. Danny hit the ground with a sound like a sack of cement being dropped, his face scraping against stone that had witnessed centuries of history. His cries of pain and shock echoed off the palace walls, as Whitmore held him in a position that rendered any further aggression impossible. The crowd erupted, cheers, applause, and shouts of approval filled the air as justice was served in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Cell phone videos captured every moment, already destined to become viral sensations shared millions of times across social media platforms. But Whitmore wasn't done. Holding Danny in place with one hand, he used his free arm to help steady Norman Briggs, who had stumbled slightly during the confrontation. The gesture was small but profound. the passing of respect from one generation of warriors to another. "Are you all right, sir?" Whitmore asked the elderly veteran, his voice filled with genuine concern. Briggs straightened his cap and smiled, his eyes twinkling with approval. "Haven't seen moves like that since the war, son. Knew you lads still had it in you." Danny, meanwhile, was discovering that cobblestones were much less forgiving than the faces he was used to pummeling. His nose was bleeding, his pride was shattered, and his arm felt like it might be broken. Worse than the physical pain was the humiliation. He'd been handled like a child by someone he dismissed as a mere tourist attraction. The sound of sirens in the distance announced the arrival of the Metropolitan Police, who had been called by palace security the moment the confrontation began. Within minutes, officers were surrounding the scene, though their job had already been done for them by Her Majesty's finest. As the police took custody of Danny, reading him his rights for assault, disturbing the peace, and public disorder, Whitmore released his hold and stepped back to his post. The transition was seamless, from combat-ready soldier back to ceremonial guard, in the space of a heartbeat. Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh had seen her share of incidents around the palace, but this one was different. The witness statements were consistent and damning. Danny had instigated everything, threatened an elderly veteran, and been subdued, with minimal force by a guard who had acted in perfect accordance with his duties. "Looks like you picked the wrong soldier to mess with," Walsh told Danny as paramedics examined his injuries. "Sergeant Whitmore served for tours in Afghanistan. He's got more medals than you've got brain cells." Danny's response was a string of profanities and threats that only served to add more charges to his growing list of legal troubles. His criminal record, already extensive, would ensure that this incident would result in serious jail time. As Danny was loaded into the ambulance, more for his own protection than out of concern for his injuries, the crowd began to disperse. But many lingered, still processing what they'd witnessed. Children asked their parents to explain what had happened, and parents struggled to find words that could capture the magnitude of the moment. Norman Briggs, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity himself. Tourists asked for photos with the D-Day veteran, and he graciously obliged, though he insisted that the real hero was Sergeant Whitmore. "You see," Briggs explained to a group of school children who had been on a field trip, "a uniform doesn't make a man, but a good man can make a uniform mean something special. That guard there, he's the real deal." The children nodded solemnly, perhaps understanding more than their teachers expected. They had witnessed something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives, the moment when symbols became reality, when tradition proved its worth, and when good triumphed over evil in the most definitive way possible. As the afternoon wore on, word of the incident spread far beyond the palace gates. Social media exploded with videos, photos, and first-hand accounts of Danny's comeuppance. The hashtag #RoyalGuard Justice began trending worldwide, with millions of people sharing their own stories of respect for veterans and active service members. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines like "Palace Guard School's Street Thug in Lesson of Respect," and "When Ceremonial Becomes Combat Ready, Guard Defends WWII Veteran." Television crews arrived at the scene, interviewing witnesses and getting reactions from people around the world. But perhaps the most telling response came from veterans themselves. Social media filled with posts from former and current service members sharing their own experiences with disrespectful civilians and expressing their pride in Sergeant Whitmore's actions. "This is what we train for," wrote one Afghanistan veteran on Twitter, "not just to fight wars, but to protect those who can't protect themselves. Job well done, mate." A Facebook group called "We Stand with Sergeant Whitmore" gained 50,000 members in the first hour after its creation. The page became a rallying point for people who believed in honor, duty, and the importance of showing respect to those who serve. Meanwhile, Whitmore himself remained at his post, seemingly unaffected by the chaos swirling around him. Tourists continued to take photos, though now with a newfound sense of awe and respect. They understood that they weren't just looking at a man in a costume, but at a guardian of something far more precious than they had realized. As evening approached, the changing of the guard ceremony proceeded exactly as it had for centuries. Whitmore was relieved by another soldier, the transition executed with military precision and centuries-old tradition. But as he marched away from his post, something was different. The small girl, perhaps 6 years old, broke free from her mother's hand and ran up to Whitmore. In her tiny fist was a single red rose that she had somehow acquired during the afternoon's excitement. Without a word, she tucked it into the laces of his polished boot. The same boot that Danny had spat upon hours earlier. Whitmore looked down at the child, and for just a moment, his stoic facade cracked. A small smile played at the corners of his mouth as he gave her the tiniest of winks. The gesture was so quick that only those closest to him caught it. But it was enough. The crowd, which had been watching the exchange with rapt attention, erupted in applause once more. But this time it wasn't just for the justice that had been served. It was for the humanity that had been revealed. Beneath the uniform, beneath the training, beneath the unwavering discipline, beat the heart of a man who understood that his duty was not just to Queen and country, but to the innocent and vulnerable. As Whitmore disappeared into the palace, his day's duty complete, the rose remained in his bootless, a symbol of redemption and hope in a world that often seemed lacking in both. Norman Briggs, still surrounded by well-wishers and reporters, watched the guard's departure with satisfaction. When asked by a journalist what he thought about the day's events, his response was simple but profound. Some men wear uniforms, he said, adjusting his veteran's cap. Others live them. That young man there, he lives it every day. The story didn't end with the sunset over Buckingham Palace. In the days that followed, Sergeant Thomas Whitmore became an international symbol of duty, honor, and the warrior spirit that still burned bright in the modern world. Letters and packages arrived at the palace from around the globe, from school children in Japan who had drawn pictures of him, from veterans in America who sent their own medals in tribute, from ordinary citizens who simply wanted to say thank you. The Ministry of Defense, initially concerned about the incident, quickly realized they had a public relations goldmine on their hands. Whitmore's actions had done more to boost respect for the military than any recruitment campaign could have achieved. His commanding officers, far from disciplining him, commended him for his restraint and professionalism under extreme provocation. Danny Callahan, meanwhile, found himself facing a very different kind of future. Charged with assault, disturbing the peace, and threatening behavior, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. His tough guy reputation, built over decades of intimidation and violence, was destroyed in the space of a few viral videos. In prison, he discovered that his fellow inmates had seen the footage too, and they weren't impressed. But, perhaps, the most important legacy of that afternoon was the reminder it provided to a world increasingly divided by cynicism and despair. In an age when heroes seemed to exist only in movies and video games, Sergeant Thomas Whitmore had shown that real heroes still walked among us. They wore uniforms, they served others before themselves, and they stood ready to protect the innocent regardless of the personal cost. The rose in his bootless had long since wilted and been replaced, but the symbol it represented, the connection between protector and protected, between duty and love, between tradition and hope, that would endure forever. Years later, when people talked about the day a thug tried to intimidate a royal guard, they wouldn't remember Danny Callahan's name, but they would remember the moment when a soldier reminded the world what true strength really looked like. And in a palace that had witnessed centuries of history, that moment would take its place among the most important of all. The guard changed, the tourists came and went, and the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace continued their eternal watch. But on that one extraordinary afternoon, something had shifted in the world's understanding of honor, duty, and the price of freedom. And that, perhaps, was the greatest victory of all.